Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Electronic Signatures in Practice, Key Law, Guidance and Recent Developments with me, Keith Markham. As always, let's begin by having a look at the agenda for this session today. So we're going to begin with a brief overview. We're going to reference particularly a document produced by the Law Commission a number of years ago that kind of sets out the background to this, from which we'll be drawing liberally. And we're also going to look at some of the general rules in terms of the relevance or not of a signature in terms of contract formation. We'll see that most of the time to form a contract, we don't need a signature, albeit it's good practice. However, there are some examples of types of contract that do require a signature, and we're obviously going to look at those and see what the requirements are. Once we've had a brief look at some of those key rules, we'll then have a look at the applicable legislation. We don't have much to talk about here. We've got something called the Electronic Communications Act from 2000 that we'll briefly go through. And then more importantly, we've got what I will call the EIDAS regulation, which is an EU regulation, which we then wrote into our law post-Brexit, which sets out different types of electronic signature and provides some further comment on that. After that, we'll then turn to different types of electronic signature. So, okay, we set out some of the background, but what physically would be a valid electronic signature? Well, we'll look at various examples as suggested by those previous sources. We'll then go on to talk about case law. So we will look at some cases on contracts of guarantee and also contracts for the sale of land, which are the two areas where typically we do require a signature, and we'll look at the most recent developments with regard to that. There's one particularly interesting case that looks at signature of WhatsApp messages with regard to a disposition of land, and we'll see what the courts had to say on that. Then we'll move on to talk about deeds. Deeds obviously slightly more complicated beast, obviously signed and witnessed classically. Again, we'll look at whether that witnessing has to be electronic or physical. What's the current position on that? And then we will look at sort of property transactions and think about the rules that the land registry has established in terms of execution of particularly deeds electronically. And then we'll look at a bit of a risk assessment generally as to which types of electronic signature you ought to be using. And finally, we will just take a quick look at the fact that in the area of sort of wills and probate, there is a proposed reform at the minute that potentially may indicate a direction of travel, particularly when it comes to things like electronic witnessing, which is something that at the minute is typically not allowed. So that's what we'll come to at the end, just to have a brief look at that.